Jan will read and I totally agree with you that we need to look at the conventions and the law. I have a question about one of the underlying principles of the argument, that is to say the perceived madness of the use in that occasion. According to our modern standards, you are saying that he is coming with a small army and was going to face a bigger army. I don't think it's that obvious that there would be a bigger army in front, not because there are more people in front, but because bigger armies were in the 14th century, and as well there is the political situation in France, which we know even if there is a truce at that point, which is quite volatile, and we know that during the combat people were still coming, there are a lot of hesitation, and the numbers, we can't be that assertive about this part of about these figures.
It's not so much what is certain, what we now know that there are all kinds of problems in France, and we know that the armies were quite small. The thing, though, I wanted to try and bring out is that if you're a general, you're a military commander who's going to attack an opponent, the tendency tends to be that the logic you should follow is worst case scenario, that the army you're going to face could be really large. You can't start from the best case scenario. Well, France is in a lot of trouble, right? The king is in not a very good mental state. His son isn't the most competent. Hey, it's going to be all right. It's going to be all right. If you go with that proposal to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, yeah, their response will be, well, you may be right, but we're not going to count on it. And you would therefore have to assume that a rational medieval military commander, if he followed those same precepts, would have had to assume that things on the other side of the channel might possibly, maybe not likely, but possibly be not very good, that the numbers he would face might be vastly superior to his. But he doesn't seem to take that into consideration. Either indicates he's mad, he's irresponsible, he's a genius because he can predict that it's not going to happen, or he's following a different set of rules. And I say the most likely answer is it's a different set of expectations, that the expectations that we impose on our opponents, on military history, are not quite the expectations medieval military commanders impose upon the situation. So,
okay, we've got three people. Virginia, then you.
Can I just follow up really on that question to Jan? Because as an ecclesiastical historian, I'm all in favour of returning religion, which was pervasive in late medieval society, to its appropriate place in military history. And I'll be talking a bit about that on Monday. But I think Jan's argument makes sense as to why Henry chooses to take the Royal Chapel with him from Harfleur on his march to Calais, rather than simply dispatching it back to London, which if they were trying to lighten their load and march efficiently, they might have chosen to do. I just wondered whether one might provocatively suggest that having squared the divine odds as well as you could by the presence of a substantial Royal Chapel, perhaps Henry V was prepared to risk this pitched battle. Although I fully accept your arguments as why people would normally.
The thing is, we don't know for certain. Yeah, the sources we have explaining motivations are from after the fact. Now, what you can expect from the sources is that they will try and make a case that makes sense for their envisaged audience. So the sources on the English side sort of suggest that he's more strongly in favour of a battle-seeking strategy. What we need to square that with is the actual behaviour, as far as we know, during the campaign, which doesn't betray that he's trying to find the French in Napoleonic fashion enforce battle upon them. It is a fairly hesitant, ambiguous traipsing through the French countryside. I'm not quite convinced by Matthew's argument that the army was travelling lightly at all. I don't think there is much evidence in the sources for that. It is based on all kinds of assumptions that seem reasonable, but there's actually the evidence for it isn't particularly strong.
Okay, green shirt.
Like I was generations of schoolboys, I was brought up on the simplistic narrative of the 100 Years' War that the English won the battles and the French won the war. And it's in that light that I'd just like to pose a question about your positioning of the centrality of God's judgment in battle. If it was that central and definitive and final, you might have expected the 100 Years' War to end at Crecy or Poitiers or at Agincourt. And they never did. If that was God's judgment, an awful lot of people that disagreed with his judgment and said, well, actually, let's have another go. And I've had this conversation with Professor Anniv. Did why didn't the French give? Did the Treaty of Troyes? Take over. Come from Agincourt. Her argument, I don't know if she's here, was no. It came from the Civil War, the collapse and everything. People didn't seem to see battle as that definitive.
Because of the inherent doubt that you could continue to express regarding the judgment of God, a complete acceptance of the verdict of battle you never find, but it does have an effect. It does have an effect. The Battle of Poitiers, the capture of the king, has an effect in leading up to the Peace of Bretigny. The same thing with Agincourt. I don't think the phase after Agincourt can be conceived of without the battle preceding it and the Treaty of Troyes. So it has an effect. It doesn't have an absolute effect. It's not like we've now put ourselves in front of God, verdict is against it, that's the end of the matter, final. That doesn't happen. But it is because just like the whole process of seeking battle is informed by, on the one hand, a search for certainty, but on the other hand, by a sense of doubt. That also affects the results of the battles when they do occur. The French, it's clearly a big blow for them. It has a major effect on the politics, but they find it very difficult to accept that it is a full and final verdict on the matter. A full and final verdict. But they can't ignore it. They can't ignore it.
It was only about the French army, only to say that in 1417, the Duke of Burgundy alone could mobilize more than 10,000 soldiers, 6,000 men-at-arms, and more than 4,000 bowmen and crossbowmen. So not to underestimate the French army at Agincourt. All the French Pays or northern France were there, and many friends of the blood. So we have to be careful.
Well, I mean, my view always is that it's difficult to know how many you're going to raise from, given the nature of military obligation. And we know, as was already mentioned by Remy, that there were people arriving, as in the famous story of Louis de Nevers, is it? Philippe de Nevers, who arrived, he's so keen to join the battle.
Oh, the Duke of Brabant.
Yeah, the Duke of
Brabant.
Yes, Duke of Brabant. He's so keen that he hasn't got his coat d'armes on. He hasn't got his coat of his heraldry. So he snatches a trumpeter's blazon, puts it on, and that's
Just like you, I think that the French mobilization is not very well known.
No.
So we have to study that, but because I think it was very erratic and very difficult. And probably the whole army was not mobilized before the first days of October.
Yes. But that makes sense as well, because you can't keep a large army in the field for any length of time. And I think the French approach, and one of the things that didn't come out of Jan Willem's talk was that the chevauchés of the 1370s, when the French adopted a sort of kind of Fabian strategy of backing off and letting the chevauchés advance through their territory, but harassing them and preventing them from plundering and indeed feeding themselves. I mean, I think the John of Gaunt, the really long one from right down to Bordeaux, I think the English are starving by the time they arrive at Bordeaux because they've not been allowed to plunder and manoeuvre. So there are lots of ways of skinning that particular cat of defeating Trebuchet, and fighting an open battle is not necessarily the best answer, whoever you're fighting. I just want to say also, Bertrand Chenet's done so much really good work on sort of warfare in this period, including a piece which I should have quoted earlier, relating directly to the use of tactics and so on, the Burgundian dukes particularly. Thank you.
I think, strangely, this debate is focused on Agincourt. God knows why. So we've almost run out of time. Are there any questions for Joanne? Yes.
When we look at genealogies in history books, we nearly always get the male ancestor, we don't get the female. Do you think the fact that the supposedly English princesses were actually Castilian as well is a complicating issue in the decision to make these alliances?
Yes, perhaps. I think you are right. It's a good clue because the contingency was so much important to define the realpolitik of the Portuguese kings that it could have happened. Yes, but it depends very much on the moments, on the periods, on the kings. Thank you.
There was another hand.
Sorry. Question about
Okay.
Portuguese? Well, I'm of course obsessed by Burgundy. So I see many Portuguese men-at-arms and knights and squires in the Burgundian army at the time of John the Fearless in 1414 and 1415. Do you see in accounts and so on Burgundians in Portuguese service at this time?
No, as far as I know, we have no news about the participation of Burgundians in the Portuguese armies. Although there was, since the beginning of the 15th century, a close tie between Portugal and Burgundy due to the marriage of Princess Isabel, daughter of John I and Philippa of Lancaster, with the Duke Philip. She became mother of Charles le Téméraire. So we have already identified many cultural influences due to the knowledge of the famous library of the Dukes of Burgundy, but not a real military participation in the Portuguese campaigns.
At the time of Agincourt, it was a one-way service only. Thank you.
All right.
I think there's one last question.
Mine's actually for Jan. To what extent does the victory of Agincourt, assuming this religious influence and the judgment of battle, does the victory of Agincourt motivate the Lancastrians, first of all Henry and then his brothers, into a determination to conquer the rest of France? Are they basically going out and believing they're on a mission from God?
Yeah, to our taste, that would put it very strongly, but I think there is an argument that can be made that it certainly confirms Henry in strengthening his belief in the justice of his cause. And whether or not it increases his ambitions, that's a tricky one. But that he actually then embarks upon what we now recognize as a very systematic campaign of conquest. It has a direct connection, I would argue, with the verdict proclaimed by God on the battlefield of Agincourt. It's hard, I think, not to make that connection.
Right, I think this session ends. Let's thank the speakers.